Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to welcome the poet James Dickey, who will read from his works tonight on this series of programs presented under the auspices of the Whitall Poetry and Literature Fund. Mr. Dickey is a native Georgian, born in Atlanta, who was educated at Clemson College in South Carolina and Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he received his bachelor's degree in 1949 and his Master of Arts degree in 1950. He is a combat veteran of the U.S. Air Force in World War II and also the Korean War. He has been a member of the Department of English in several colleges and universities: Rice University, the University of Florida, Reed College, and currently is at San Fernando Valley State College in California. Thus, he is at home in academic surroundings. He also has had 6 years' experience working in advertising in New York City and in Atlanta. Mr. Dickey's published books of poetry began with Into the Stone and Other Poems, published in 1960, which is in the series Poets of Today, published by Scribner's. I think it is volume 7. Drowning with Others appeared in 1962, Helmets, 1964, and Two Poems of the Air in 1964 also. His most recent book, Buckdancer's Choice, was published this year. He also is an essayist and critic with a volume entitled The Suspect in Poetry, which was published also in 1964. Perhaps I should not say anything about Mr. Dickey's poetry, but let it speak for itself. I can hardly, however, forego the opportunity to say that I have been personally very much impressed and interested in Mr. Dickey's poetry. It has for subject a world which I think all of us know and recognize. But that world is bathed in his poetry in a light of strangeness. If I might quote from poetry itself, it's a light that never was on land and sea, land or sea. There is something of a mystical quality. I remember one of his poems in which he takes the reader on a deer hunt, in which I felt at least as if I were being pursued by Francis Thompson's Hound of Heaven before I got to the end of it. Mr. Dickey's published work has received wide critical acclaim. His is a moving voice. Last January, he wrote an account which appeared in the New York Times Sunday book review section of his various reading tours. I believe it was called Barnstorming for Poetry. Some of you who knew our late patron and donor, Mrs. Whitall, may be interested to know that she read this and said, "Here is a man we should have on our programs." Well, here he is, Mr. James Dickey. One other comment: there will be a short intermission between parts 1 and part 2 of the reading.
I'll read about 5 or 6 things, or 7 maybe. and then there'll be a short kind of an intermission in which the reader will disappear, and you can disappear as well briefly. I wanted to read just a few things this evening. I haven't fixed them in any kind of sequence. There'll be. I tried to get a kind of a spread over most of my work, to where you could get some kind of an idea of what I do, or what I have done rather. The first one is a poem which I would like to think is some kind of commentary on the aging process and the difference between how you look at things when you're a child and how you look at them when you're older and know better. I remember being down in the south of Georgia on the coastal islands and seeing convicts work on driving down bridge pilings. And I also remember that there was a flash of the sun on a hammer of a convict as he was driving down a piling. And behind it there must have been a seagull or something, because I remember that right where the sun flashed on the hammer there was a bird, and it seemed to me then, and to a much lesser extent now, it seemed to me perfectly natural that the bird would be born sort of spontaneously out of this flash of the sun on this metal where this convict was working on a bridge. And the poem, I guess, takes off from that idea that what you thought was natural and proper in the days when you were a child, you now sadly know is not so. Then you go back to the same place, sort of furtively hoping that the same thing will happen again and you'll believe it again, though you know that even if you saw it happen, you wouldn't be able to believe it. There's too much knowledge in between that time and this. As I say, as a kind of commentary, I'd like to think on the sad process of aging and the losing of the illusions of the childhood era. A poem called At Darien Bridge. The sea here used to look as if many convicts had built it, standing deep in their ankle chains, ankle deep in the water, to smite the land and break it down to salt. I was in this bog as a child, where they were all working all day to drive the pilings down. I thought I saw the still sun strike the side of a hammer in flight, and from it a seabird be born to take off over the marshes. As the gray climbs the side of my head and cuts my brain off from the world, I walk and wish mainly for birds, for the one bird no one has looked for, to spring again from a flash of metal, perhaps from the scratched wedding band on my ring finger. Recalling the chains of their feet, I stand and look out over grasses at the bridge they built, long abandoned, breaking down into water at last, and long like them for freedom or death, or to believe again that they worked on the ocean to give it the unchanging, hopeless look out of which all miracles leap. There's also another point. If you should think from that my work, some of it deals with a kind of an unbearable nostalgia, that is unbearable to the poet at any rate, you would be right. Some things that you see and that you can't hold because you can't stop the passage of time are indeed unbearable, or surely they are to me. There was a poem I began in Edinburgh a few years ago when I was in a taxi cab and I saw a girl cross the street. Just saw her briefly, and I remember thinking of a line of Apollinaire. She was so beautiful she made me afraid. But I had a piece of paper or something, and I scratched down the idea for a poem about this feeling that people have occasionally of seeing a face once in your life and then not seeing it anymore, but this face having a special kind of nostalgia for you. There are lots of faces that you see one time in your life. You've seen a lot of them today. You have and I have. People that just go by on the street, somebody going by in a streetcar, somebody in a department store, in a drugstore. You see them and they go past. So do you. What might have been an encounter, and somehow there's never any way to speak to these people, they least of all probably would understand it. But at any rate, the encounter, the thread snaps and they go one way and you go the other. But there is a special poignancy about that, at least for me. And I thought maybe that the sum total of all the faces that you see once in your life might make up a kind of a composite face. Out of all these momentary encounters, no matter where they happen, in your hometown or in some place that you happen to be passing through, and that these might make up a kind of a composite face, and that this in turn would be the thing that at the moment of death would blaze up most terribly in the mind as being emblematic of all the unfulfilled possibilities in your life. So I made a poem out of this. I guess it might interest you to know as well that, because I wrote it into the poem, that the first face that I really looked at as a face was a face of another boy, my brother actually, in North Georgia, when we were looking at each other through a drain pipe a section of a drain pipe that we were playing with. I remember seeing his face against a blue kind of sky and a pine tree back of him, and I thought, gee, I never really saw that fellow before, my brother. He's pretty remarkable looking when you see him through a drain pipe. And I hoped thereby that I would look the same to him. Anyway, it's a poem called Faces Seen Once. Faces seen once are seen to fade from around one feature, leaving a chin, a scar, and expression forever in the air beneath a streetlight, glancing in boredom from the window of a bus in a country town, showing teeth for a moment only, all of which die out of mind except one silver one. Who had the dog-bitten ear, the granulated lids, the birthmark? Faces seen once change always into and out of each other, and I, you saw in Toulon, is gazing at you down a tin drain pipe you played with as a dull child in Robertstown, Georgia. There it is April. The one eye concentrates. The rusty pipe is trembling. Behind the eye is a pine tree blurring with tears. You in someone's blue eye transforming your boyhood are weeping for an only son drowned in warm water with the French fleet off Senegal. Soon after, the cancer-clamped face of your great-grandfather relaxes, smiles again with the lips of a newsboy. Faces seen once make up one face, being organized and changed and known less all the time. Unsexed, amorphous, growing in necessity as you deepen in age. The brow wrinkles, a blind, all-knowing, questioning look comes over it, and every face in the street begins to partake of the look in the eyes. Every nose is part of that nose and changes the nose. Every innocence and every unspoken of guilt goes into it, into the face of the one encountered unknowable person who waits for you all over the world, in coffee shops, filling stations, bars, in mills and orphan asylums, in hospitals, prisons, at parties, yearning to be one thing. At your death, it is there, and the features congeal, having taken the last visage in over you, pretesting its smile. The skin, the indwelling, no color of all colors mingled, the eyes asking all there is. Composed your own face trembles near joining that other, knowing that finally something must break or speak. A silver tooth gleams, you mumble whispering, you are human, or what I have witnessed, you are all faces seen once. Through the bent, staring, unstable dark of a drain pipe, unity hears you, a God roar of hearing. Say only, you are an angel's too realized, unbearable, memoryless face. There is a poem that I wrote about some experiences of mine growing up in North Georgia, where I used to ride a motorcycle. You have to know, or might be helpful to know, that North Georgia is full of bootleggers, and consequently there are a lot of wrecks. As I remember, I went back up to buy some whiskey. I hope this doesn't offend the government. I went up to buy some whiskey from my bootlegger last summer, and his name is Ira Gentry. And I said, Ira, when are you going to get some industry up in North Georgia? And he said, we don't want no industry in North Georgia. We like it like it is. But I'll tell you one thing, Jim, he said. Making whiskey is a damn good industry when you ain't got no industry. There are a lot of wrecks and chasing. I used to run a little whiskey myself. Again, I hope the government, I think the statute of limitations obtains here. And my brother was a deputy sheriff up there, and he used to chase me around. And I remember one time he caught me. And we sat down and had a drink. But there are a lot of wrecks up there, and mostly 34 Fords. That was the big bootlegging car when I was growing up. Big engine, light body, you know. The bootleggers all had them, but so did the sheriffs. But there are a lot of wrecks of 34 Fords and other kinds of cars there. And so there are a lot of automobile junkyards. And this concerns one of those. It concerns a girl that I went with when I was about 15 or 16, whose name was Doris Holbrook, whose father took what I thought was a very irrational dislike to me and forbade me to come out, although he wouldn't understand it in quite those terms, told me that I was not to show up around the vicinity anymore. I went along with that for a while, and so did she, but finally we decided to try to do something about it. There was he kept her under pretty close surveillance for, as I remember, and the only time that she could get away from him was they were real poor people, and she would come up sometimes at around noon with a wrench and a pair of pliers to the junkyard at the corner of the little dirt road, Cherry Log Road, that she lived on, the corner of that and the state highway, and get fenders and things off the junked cars to sell for scrap. There we saw our chance. Now, she would come up Cherry Log Road with her wrench and pliers, and I would come blasting in from the opposite direction on my Harley. And we would work into the center of the junkyard from opposite sides. Somehow it seemed important to get to the center. And I can remember my route in through the highway. I went through the back seats of 334 Fords, and then through an Essex rumble seat over the top of one, and then over the hood of some other kind of an old car. And we would meet in this old Pierce Arrow. That was right in the middle, you know. Old car. The first one who got there would sit there, and in the car, it was very comfortable, a wide back seat. And it had the remnants of a glass panel, between the driver's seat and the front seat. And it had an interphone there and everything, a little vase for flowers. And the one who got there first would sit in the car in the midst of all these jumbled up wrecks and wait for the other one. There were vines growing all over them, and there were all these little creatures that lived in there. Mice and snakes, turtles, frogs. And you'd hear all these little scrambling sounds going on all the time. And the one who got there first would wait in the back seat. It was very pleasant. It was awful hot in the summer times, I remember. And thinking that every sound that you heard was the other one coming, and thinking also it might be the father. But it was terribly exciting. I remember with very great nostalgia. So I never thought of it as material for poetry, but I finally wrote a poem about it and sent it into the New Yorker, and my editor said, we'd better change the girl's name, if this really was her name, Doris Holbrook, because we might be liable to suit if she reads it and finds some kind of a case against you for mentioning her name in a connection in which she figured. And I wrote back to my editor there. I said, no, let's go ahead and publish it like it is, because I don't think she reads the New Yorker. You can make of that what you will. Anyway, it was published in the New Yorker, and about a week or 10 days later, 7 women wrote to me that said they remembered it well. But why didn't I say it was really in Kansas? And I wrote back to them, and I said, well, actually, it wasn't in, I hate to disappoint you, but it wasn't in Kansas, it was in Georgia, and I was not really the one, but, maybe next time, Anyway, this is a poem incorporating all that data called Cherry Log Road. Off Highway 106 at Cherry Log Road, I entered the 34 Ford without wheels, smothered in kudzu, with a seat pulled out to run corn whiskey down from the hills. And then from the other side crept into an Essex with a rumble seat of red leather, and then out again aboard a blue Chevrolet, releasing the rust from its other color, reared up on 3 building blocks. None had the same body heat. I changed with them inward toward the weedy heart of the junkyard, for I knew that Doris Holbrook would escape from her father at noon, and would come from the farm to seek parts owned by the son among the abandoned chassis, sitting in each in turn as I did, leaning forward as in a wild stock car race in the parking lot of the dead. Time after time I climbed in and out the other side like an envoy or movie star met at the station by crickets. A radiator cap raised its head, become a real toad or a king snake, as I neared the hub of the yard, passing through many states, many lives, to reach some grandmother's long pierce arrow, sending platters of blindness forth from its nickel hubcaps, and spilling its tender upholstery on sleepy roaches, the glass panel in between lady and colored driver not all the way broken out, the back seat phone still on its hook. I got in as though to exclaim, "Let us go to the orphan asylum, John. I have some old toys for children who say their prayers." I popped with sweat as I thought I heard Doris Holbrook scrape like a mouse in the southern state sun that was eating the paint in blisters from 100 car tops and hoods. She was tapping like code, loosening the screws, carrying off headlights, spark plugs, bumpers, cracked mirrors and gear knobs, getting ready already to go back with something to show other than her lips new trembling I would hold to me soon, soon, where I sat in the ripped back seat talking over the interphone, praying for Doris Holbrook to come from her father's farm and to get back there with no trace of me on her face, to be seen by her red-haired father, who would change in the squalling barn her back's pale skin with a strop, then lay for me in a bootlegger's roasting car with a string-triggered 12-gauge shotgun to blast the breath from the air. Not cut by the jagged windshields, Through the acres of wrecks she came with a wrench in her hand. Through dust where the black snake dies of boredom and the beetle knows the compost has no more life. Someone outside would have seen the oldest car's door inexplicably close from within. I held her and held her and held her, convoyed at terrific speed by the stalled, dreaming traffic around us, so the black snake, stiff with inaction, curved back into life and hunted the mouse with deadly overexcitement. The beetles reclaimed their field as we clung glued together, with the hooks of the seat springs working through to catch us red-handed, amidst the gray, breathless batting that burst from the seat at our backs. We left by separate doors into the changed other bodies of cars. She down Cherry Log Road, and I to my motorcycle, parked like the soul of the junkyard restored, a bicycle fleshed with power, and tore off up Highway 106, continually drunk on the wind in my mouth, ringing the handlebar for speed, wild to be wreckage forever. I've got another newer poem, a love poem, if such it may be called, simply called Sun, about two very badly sunburned lovers, where you have the dilemma of wanting to come into proximity. I mean, that's sort of a euphemism, and not being able to because of this temporary condition of the flesh, skin, you know. I mean, you see what I mean. This could be, well, not exactly embarrassing, but frustrating. Indeed, it was. I wrote about it, and I minored in astrophysics in college, as I remember, and I very, very vaguely remember, and I tried to get a couple of images of sun images from those marvelous sun photographs that you take through telescopes, where they have those million-mile banners of flame spooling up off the surface of the sun, you know, and disappearing. And I thought maybe if you lay long enough to get as sunburned as these two people are supposed to have done, then, and looking up through your eyelids as though through those smoked glasses that you can see these solar phenomena through, that you might see those long streamers of flame tear off the sun's surface. But mainly it's a poem about two people in love and in a temporary condition in which it's very painful to be in love. There's a poem called Sun. O Lord, it was all night consuming me, skin crawling tighter than any skin of my teeth, bleary with ointments, dazzling through the dark house, man red as iron, glowing, blazing up anew with each bad breath from the bellowing curtains. I had held the sun longer than it could stay, and in the dark it turned my face on infrared. There were cracks circling my eyes where I had squinted up from stone-blind sand and seen eternal fire, coronas, huge vertical banners of flame leap scrollingly from the sun and tatter to nothing in blue-veined space on the smoked crimson glass of my lids. When the sun fell, I slit my eye skins in the dazed, ruddy muddle of twilight, and in the mirror saw whiteness run from my eyes like tears, going upward and sideways, slanting as well as falling, all in straight lines like rays shining. And behind me, careful not to touch without giving me a chance to brace myself, a smeared, suffering woman came merging her flame-shaken body halo with mine, her nose still clownish with oxides, walked to me sweating blood and turned around. I peeled off her bathing suit like her skin, her colors wincing, she silently biting her tongue off, her back crisscrossed with stripes where winter had caught her and whipped her. We stumbled together, and in the double heat, the last of my blonde hair blazed up, burned off me forever, as we dived for the cool of the bed, in agony even at holding hands, the blisters on our shoulders shifting, crackling, releasing boiling water on the sheets. O Lord, who can turn out the sun, turn out that neighbor's one bulb on his badminton court. For we are dying of light, searing each other, not able to stop, to get away. She's screaming, O Lord Apollo, or water, water, as the moonlight drove us down on the tangled grid, where in the end we lay suffering equally. In the sun backlashed from the moon's brutal stone, and meeting itself where we had stored it up all afternoon in pain, in the gentlest touch, as we lay, O Lord, in hell, in love. I have just a couple of three more short ones, or three short ones and a little longer one before the well-announced intermission. One of these is a poem about a brother that I had but never saw. He died of typhoid, I think it was, before I was born. But I used to hear about him all the time I was growing up. My mother used to talk about him a lot. And I never got a very clear concept of what he was like, except from just a few things that my mother said about him. And one of these was that he used to do a lot of string tricks, making cat's cradles and Jacob's ladders and things of that sort with string, and that he was doing this right up until the time that he actually did die. This is strange and wonderful to me, and I also remember hearing an aunt of mine say, I was the next child after this boy, that I myself would never have been conceived and never have been born if the other boy had not died, that the family was complete with him, but when he died there was some feeling that there was some need for some new member, so that happened to be me. I don't know how much truth there is in that, but I know that it made an enormous impression on me when I was a child, so that I was full of guilt about it, about living at the expense of somebody else having to die, who happened to be a brother of mine, who happened to be somebody that I had never seen. So with this in mind, I wrote a poem called The String, about the string tricks as I remembered, as I thought maybe they might have been, and about my own child, who at the time of the writing of the poem was about 5 or 6 years old, which is what my brother was when he died. A poem called The String. Except when he enters my son, the same age as he at his death, I cannot bring my brother to myself. I do not have his memory in my life, yet he is in my mind and on my hands. I weave the trivial string upon a light, dead before I was born. Mark how the brother must live, who comes through the words of my mother. I have been told he lay in his deathbed singing with fever, performing with string on his fingers incredible feats of construction there before he was born. His Jacob's coffin now floats deeply between my fingers. The strings with my thin bones shake. My eyes go from me and down through my bound, spread hands to the dead from the kin of the dead, dead before I was born. The gaze of genius comes back. The rose window of Chartres is in it, and Diogenes lines upon sand, and the sun through the Brooklyn Bridge, and caught in a web the regard of a skeletal, blood-sharing child, dead before I was born. I believe in my father and mother, finding no hope in these lines. Out of grief I was myself conceived and brought to life to replace the incredible child who built on this string in a fever, dead before I was born. A man, I make the same forms for my son that my brother made, who learnt them going to heaven, the coffin of light, the bridge, the cup and saucer of pure air, cradle of cat, the foot of a crow, dead before I was born. I raise up the bridge and the tower. I burn the knit coffin in sunlight, for the child who has woven this city, who loved doing this to die, who thought like a spider and sang and completed the maze of my fingers, dead before I was born. There's a poem of mine that I wrote a few years ago, which has to do, it really took its origin from a film of Walt Disney called The African Lion. I always go to the Disney films because if you're a poet or if you're one of my own particular or perhaps peculiar persuasion, you like images more than you like anything else. And the ones that haunt you the most or seem to you the most beautiful are the ones that you eventually use. I found a lot of these in the Disney nature films, the animal films. Nature's Half Acre and White Wilderness with a wonderful 20-minute sequence on the wolverine. I immediately adopted the wolverine as my totem animal as a result. I don't know whether that means very much to the wolverine, but it means a lot to me. And a movie called The African Lion, which I liked so much that I kept going back to see so many times that even my children wouldn't go with me anymore. There was a sequence where a leopard jumped down off the limb of a tree and pulled down a wildebeest calf and tore it to pieces and ate it. But the trouble with the Disney films, if the guy would just clam up, it would be all right. I mean, you'd see really the brute reality of the world in a way that I don't think you could see it in any other place. But all the time, this one animal is rending another limb from limb, or gutting it, as we used to say at home. This unctuous voice is talking on and on about the great cycle of nature. And you know how nothing is wasted, and even the young of the vulture are fed from the kill. And sure enough, the camera pans up, and there the mother vultures feeding the little vultures. But it seemed to me that it would be very cold comfort to the animal being torn apart to know that he's contributing to the great cycle of nature in just that way. But anyway, if you're a writer, and if you're an angry enough middle-aged man, you can do something about it, at least just for that poem on that particular page. I was reading Aquinas and some of the other early Christian theologians when I saw this film, and I was taking cognizance of their long and very learned arguments as to why the animals don't have any souls and therefore no immortality. This seems a radical injustice to me, and I tried to write a poem in which this would be to some extent rectified, and try to imagine a heaven where animals would go after death and be eternal and everything. I saw when I began to try to write this that the main problem was to invent a place which really would be a heaven for animals, but which would also not rob the animals of their essence, of their identity. The hunters would still hunt, the hunted would still be hunted. And this was a dilemma that I came perilously close not to solving. It was very tough for me. I thought many times when I was trying to write this, no wonder the Lord gave up on it. But I came to what I thought was a fairly decent solution, and if he's listening now, I think maybe he might avail himself of the opportunity to change things around a little bit. He comes to all my readings, even if none other but the faithful do. Poetry lovers and everything. Anyway, it's a poem called The Heaven of Animals, and it begins with the animal waking up after death in the great good place, which he doesn't deserve, but which I have seen fit to give him. Here they are, the soft eyes open. If they have lived in a wood, it is a wood. If they have lived on plains, it is grass rolling under their feet forever. Having no souls, they have come anyway, beyond their knowing. Their instincts wholly bloom, and they rise, the soft eyes open. To match them, the landscape flowers, desperately outdoing what is required, the richest wood, the deepest field. For some of these it could not be the place it is without blood. These hunt as they have done, but with claws and teeth grown perfect, more deadly than they can believe. They stalk more silently and crouch on the limbs of trees, and their descent upon the bright backs of their prey may take years in a sovereign floating of joy. And those that are hunted know this as their life, their reward, to walk under such trees in full knowledge of what is in glory above them, and to feel no fear but acceptance, compliance, fulfilling themselves without pain at the cycle center. They tremble, they walk under the tree, they fall, they are torn, they rise, they walk again. I have two more that I'd like to read before we're in a mission, if I may. One of them they're both poems about warfare. One of them is a poem about my best friend during the war years, a pilot with the 418th Night Fighter Squadron in New Guinea and the Philippines and on Okinawa. If there's any need for any possibility or any possibility of there being any need to dedicate anything to anybody, I would like to dedicate this to his memory because I remember him with overpowering love. He was a boy who was as unremarkable as I was, except that he just happened to be in the war with me and flying in the same squadron. But we were just about inseparable all the time, and during the early part of the time we were overseas. The thing I remember most about him, I tried for years to write something about Don, and there was I couldn't make anything that seemed to be worth finishing. It didn't seem, worthy of what I remembered of him, until I tried to use the thing that would seem on the surface of it to be the most insignificant thing about him. He came from Utah or Nevada, one of the mountain states, and he had been a member of the university gymnastics team, and he could do the most amazing things, flips and kip-ups and all kinds of double somersaults and strange, weird things. But he was a real tall, thin boy, and he was relatively weak in the arms and shoulders. And he used to say that when he got back to school, he never doubted for a moment that he would eventually survive the war and go back to the University of Utah or Utah State or wherever he came from and be on the college gymnastics team again. He thought that when he went back that he would then, because of all the practice that he'd had overseas, have a very strong arms and shoulders, and he would be able to perform a lot of stuff from the handstand position. But his balance was not awfully good upside down, as I don't suppose very many people's are. And he used to get out in the squadron area and stand on his hands, or try to, and develop that part of things. And I remember him falling over on his head and on his back and getting up and trying again. This seemed to me, years later when I tried to write this, I finally came to this way of doing it. The most characteristic thing about him, this kind of perseverance in a discipline which only he himself had set for himself, as odd as it was, as odd as it seemed to everybody else in the squadron. And I remembered this and tried to write about it, and this in conjunction with the way he died. He was on a dawn strafing run on an island to the south of us, Panay it was, in the Philippines, and he miscalculated the altitude apparently and hit the ground and wrecked his airplane, was taken out by the Japanese and beheaded. Through 2 or 3 Japanese soldiers who were responsible for it were tried for war crimes in Manila after the war and executed. But the handstand thing and the being beheaded seemed to me to comment on each other, and I wrote this poem which was published in my first book, which I call A Performance. It might interest you as well to know that the last time I actually did see him was at sunset just before we took off one night, a couple of nights before he was killed. And I remember I was digging a slit trench or a latrine or something, and I had a shovel in my hand, and I had to sort of shade my eyes with my hand to see him up there against the sun, sort of still trying to perform handstands and perfect this part of his gymnastic equipment. The last time I saw Donald Armstrong, he was staggering oddly off into the sun going down of the Philippine Islands. I let my shovel fall and put that hand above my eyes and moved some way to one side that his body might pass through the sun. And I saw how well he was not standing there on his hands, on his spindle-shanked forearms, unbalanced, with his big feet looming and waving in the great untrustworthy air he flew in each night when it darkened. Dust fanned and scraped puffs from the earth between his arms, and blood turned his face inside out to demonstrate its suppleness of veins as he perfected his role. Next day he toppled his head off on an island beach to the south, and the enemy's two-handed sword did not fall from anyone's hands at that miraculous sight. As the head rolled over upon its wide-eyed face and fell into the inadequate grave he had dug for himself under pressure. Yet I put my flat hand to my eyebrows months later to see him again in the sun when I learned how he died, and imagined him there come judged before his small captors, doing all his lean tricks to amaze them, the back somersault, the kip up, and at last the stand on his hands, perfect with his feet together, his head down evenly breathing, as the sun poured up from the sea, and the headsman broke down in a blaze of tears in that light of the thin, long human frame, upside down in its own strange joy. And if some other one had not told him, would have cut off the feet instead of the head. And if Armstrong had not presently risen in kingly round-shouldered attendance, and then knelt down in himself beside his hacked, glittering grave, having done all things in this life that he could. There's another poem a little longer than that, which I wrote much more recently, about one of the things that anybody who has ever been in the Air Force surely has noted. Despite the bombings and the records of destruction that your squadron might have achieved, to great applause and presidential citations and medals for various parties concerned and so on, there's very little sense of guilt concerned with killing other people, simply because you don't have any proximity to what you've done. You have never seen the results. This is a poem called The Firebombing, which is about a man who's lived in the suburbs for 20 years and hasn't done anything violent the 20 years following the war. He's been a good citizen and mowed the lawn and bought the groceries, and yet sometimes he wakes up at 4:30 in the morning and thinks, yes, I did that. I was in a squadron which specialized in firebombing, and I must have killed a lot of people, although I never saw any of them. He thinks about this in connection with his own home and his own family. And but mainly, I suppose it's a poem about the inability, the guilt attendant on the inability to feel guilt, simply because you've never seen the results of what you ought to feel guilty about. This seems to me the most terrible thing of all in connection with modern war. This is prefaced by two quotations. One of them is from the German of Günther Eich, and translated would be, think of this, that after the great destructions, everyone will prove he was innocent. The other is from the book of Job. Or hast thou an arm like God? Again, it's a meditation 20 years after the fact of a householder remembering what it was like to fly firebombing missions over Japan in the middle 40s. And after this, there'll be a very brief intermission. Homeowners unite. All families lie together, though some are burned alive. The others try to feel for them. Some can, it is often said. Starve and take off 20 years in the suburbs, and the palm trees willingly leap into the flashlights, and there is beneath them also a booted crackling of snail shells and coral sticks. There are cowl flaps and the tilt cross of propellers, the shovel-marked clouds far sides against the moon, the enemy filling up the hills with ceremonial graves. At my somewhere among these, snap, a bulb is tricked on in the cockpit, and some technical-minded stranger with my hands is sitting in a glass treasure hole of blue light, having potential fire under the undeodorized arms of his wings on thin bomb shackles, the teardrop-shaped 300-gallon drop tanks filled with napalm and gasoline. Thinking forward 10 minutes from that, there is also the burst straight out of the overcast into the moon. There is now the moon metal shine of propellers, the quarter moonstone aimed at the waves, stopped on the cumulus. There is then this re-entry into cloud for the engines to ponder their sound. In white dark the aircraft shrinks. Japan dilates around it like a thought. Coming out, the one who is here is over land, passing over the all-night grain fields, in dark paint over the woods with one silver side, rice water calm at all levels of the terraced hill. Enemy rivers and trees sliding off me like snakeskin, strips of vapor spooled from the wingtips, going, invisible, passing, over, on, over, bridges, roads for night walkers, Sunday night in the enemy's country, absolute calm, the moon's face coming slowly about. The inland sea slants, is woven with wire thread, levels out, holds together like a quilt off the starboard wing. Cloud flickers at my glassed-off forehead, the moon's now and again uninterrupted face going forward over the waves in a glide path, lost into land. Going with it. Combat booze by my side in a cratered canteen, bourbon frighteningly mixed with GI pineapple juice, dogs trembling under me for hundreds of miles on many islands, sleep smelling that ungodly mixture of napalm and high-octane fuel, good bourbon and GI juice. Rivers circling behind me around come to the fore and bring a town with everyone darkened. 5,000 people are sleeping off an all-day American drone. 20 years in the suburbs have not shown me which ones were hit and which not. Haul on the wheel, racking slowly, the aircraft blackly around, in a dark dream that is like flying inside someone's head. Think of this. Think of this. I did not think of my house, but think of my house now, where the lawnmower rests on its laurels, where the diet exists for my own good, where I try to drop 20 years eating figs in the pantry, blinded by each and all of the eye-catching cans that gladly have caught my wife's eye, until I cannot say where the screwdriver is, where the children get off the bus, where the new scoutmaster lives, where the fly hones his front legs, where the hammock folds its erotic daydreams, where the Sunday school text for the day has been put, where the firewood is, where the payments for everything under the sun pile peacefully up. But in this half-paid-for pantry among the red lids that screw off with an easy half-twist to the left, and the long drawers crammed with dim spoons, I still have charge, secret charge, of the fire developed to cling to everything, to golf carts and fingernails, scissors as yet unborn, tennis shoes, grocery baskets, toy fire engines, new Buicks stalled by the half-moon shining at midnight on crossroads, green paint of jolly garden tools, red Christmas ribbons, Not atoms these, but glue, inspired by love of country to burn, the apotheosis of gelatin. Behind me, having risen the Southern Cross set up by chaplains in their Ryukyus, Orion, Scorpio, the immortal silver like the myths of king insects at swarming time. One mosquito, dead drunk on altitude, drones on far under the engines and bites between the oxygen mask and the eye. The enemy-colored skin of families determines to hold its color in sleep as my hand turns whiter than ever, clutching the toggle. The ship shakes, bucks, fire hangs, not yet fire, in the air above Beppu, for I am fulfilling an anti-morale raid upon it. All leashes of dogs break under the first bomb, around those in bed or late in the public baths, around those who inch forward on their hands into medicinal waters. Their heads come up with a roar of Chicago fire, come up with the carp pond showing the bathhouse upside down, standing stiller to show it more as I sail artistically over the resort town followed by farms, singing and twisting all the handles in heaven, kicking the small cattle off their feet in a red, costly blast, flinging jelly over the walls as in a chemical warfare field demonstration. With fire of mine like a cat holding on to another man's walls, my hat should crawl on my head in streetcars thinking of it. The fat on my body should pale. Gun down the engines, the 8 blades sighing for the moment when the roofs will connect their flames and make a town burning with all American fire. Reflections of houses catch, fire shuttles from pond to pond in every direction till hundreds flash with one death. With this in the dark of the mind, death will not be what it should, will not even now, even when my exhaled face in the mirror of bars dilates in a cloud like Japan. The death of children is ponds, shutter flashing, responding mirrors. It climbs the terraces of hills, smaller and smaller, a mote of red dust at 100 feet. At 101 it goes out. That is what should have got into my eye and shown the insides of houses. The low tables catch fire from the floor mats, blaze up in gas around their heads like a dream of suddenly growing too intense for war. Ah, under one's dark armpits something strange scented falls. When those on earth die, there is not even sound. One is cool and enthralled in the cockpit, turned blue by the power of beauty, in a pale treasure hole of soft light deep in aesthetic contemplation, seeing the ponds catch fire and cast it through ring after ring of land. Oh, death in the middle of acres of inch-deep water. Useless firing, small arms, speckles from the river bank, one 90 millimeter misses, far down, wrong petals, gone. It is this detachment, the honored aesthetic evil, the greatest sense of power in one's life, that must be shed in bars or by whatever means, by starvation visions and well-stocked pantries. The moment when the moon sails in between the tail booms, the rudders nod, I swing directly over the heart of the fire. A mosquito burns out on my cheek with the cold of my face. There are the eyes in blue light, bar light, all masked but them, the moon crossing from left to right. In the streams below, oriental fish form quickly in the chemical shine. In their eyes, one tiny seed of deranged Old Testament light. Letting go, the plane rises gently. Dark forms glide off me. Long water pails in safe zones. A new cry enters the voice box of chained family dogs. We buck, leap over something not there, settle back, leave it, clinging and crying. It consumes them in a hot body flash, old age or menopause of children, clings and burns, eating through. And when a reed mat catches fire from me, it explodes through field after field, bearing its sleeper. Another bomb finds a home and clings to it like a child. And so, goodbye to the grassy mountains, to clouds streaming from the night engines, flags, pennons, curved silks of air, myself streaming also, my body covered with flags, the air of flags between the engines. Forever I do sleep in that position, forever in a turn for home that breaks out streaming banners from my wingtips, wholly in position to admire. Oh, then I knock it off and turn for home over the black complex thread worked through the silver night sea, following the huge moon-washed stepping stones of the Ryukyus south, the night grass of mountains billowing softly in my rising heat. Turn and tread down the yellow stones of the islands to where Okinawa burns pure gold on the radar screen, beholding beneath the actual island form in the vast water silver poured just above solid ground, an inch of water extending for thousands of miles above flat plowland. Say, down, and it is done. All this, and I am still hungry, still 20 years overweight, still unable to get down there or see what really happened. But it may be that I could not if I tried. Say to any who live there deep in my flames. Say in cold grinning sweat as to another of these homeowners who are always curving near me down the different grassed street. Say as though to the neighbor I borrowed the hedge clippers from on the darker grassed side of the two. Come in, my house is yours. Come in if you can pass this unfired door. It is that I can imagine at the threshold nothing with its ears crackling off like powdery leaves, nothing with children of ashes, nothing not amiable, gentle, well-meaning, a little nervous for no reason, a little worried, a little too loud or too easygoing, nothing I haven't lived with for 20 years, still nothing not as American as I am and proud of it. Absolution, sentence, no matter. The thing itself is in that. It now looks as though I have maybe overextended myself from the standpoint of time. So the second half of the program, I won't read all those. I'll just read the first four. The last one is a little longer than the others, but I think Anna will be satisfied with it. Only four, at least I trust so. The first is a poem about my mother and father and myself. In one of those situations where you see people that you thought could never surprise you, in circumstances where you would never think you would encounter them. When you see familiar people in circumstances where they are unfamiliar and where everything they do becomes strange and sort of symbolical in some kind of way. This particular situation was when I was a teenager in a fairgrounds, a carnival up north of Atlanta, and I was just sort of out there trying to pick up a woman or just sort of waste time as you do. And I saw my mother and father, these old people there, sort of dating at the age of 65. It was weird. It really was very strange. And I thought, that can't be them. They were the most uncarnival-like people that you can imagine, yet there they were. So, as in a kind of a dream, I took to following them around the fairgrounds. And I can report everything they did from that point. And if you want to know what they did, I can tell you. They went on the Dodgem cars, where people try to run into each other in these little cars. They have those at Disneyland. And after being on the Los Angeles freeways, I sometimes have to go out to Disneyland and work out my aggressions on those things where you try to run into somebody. Anyway, they did that, and my father won a teddy bear, a stuffed teddy bear, throwing those baseballs that are light as a ping pong ball at those heavily weighted milk bottles. Do they still have that, or has that long since passed away? Anyway, he won that, and then they went on the Ferris wheel, and I just sort of stood there watching my mother and father go around, and then went away, and that's just all there was to the episode. But I wrote this about it, thinking about them and the situation in which they figured that they didn't think I saw them, in which they didn't think I saw them, and tried to work in something of the wheel motif of all carnivals, gambling wheels, Ferris wheels. Even the roller coaster has to come back the way it starts, and the Dodgem cars as well. A poem called The Celebration. All wheels, a man breathed fire, exhaling like a blowtorch down the road, and burnt the stripper's gown above her moving barely feet. A condemned train climbed from the earth, up stilted night lights zooming in a track. I ambled along in that crowd between the gambling wheels at carnival time with the others, where the Dodgem cars shuddered, sparking on grill wire, each in his vehicle half in control, half helplessly power mad, as he was in the traffic that brought him. No one blazed at me. Then I saw my mother and my father, he leaning on a dog-chewed cane, she wrapped to the nose in the fur of exhausted weasels. I believe them buried miles back in the country, in the faint sleep of the old, and had not thought to be on this of all nights compelled to follow where they led, not losing sight, with my heart enlarging whenever I saw his crippled Stetson bob, saw her with the teddy bear one on the waning whip of his right arm. They laughed, she clung to him. And then suddenly the wheel of wheels was turning the colored night around. They climbed aboard. My God, they rose above me, stopped themselves and swayed 50 feet up. He pointed with his toothed cane and took in the whole midway till they dropped, came down, went from me, came and went faster and faster, going up backward, cresting, out-topping, falling roundly. From the crowd I watched them, their gold teeth flashing, until my eyes blurred with their riding lights, and I turned from the standing to the moving mob and went on. Stepped upon sparking shocks of recognition when I saw my feet among the others, knowing them given, understanding the whirling impulse from which I had been born, the great gift of shaken lights, the being wholly lifted with another, all this having all and nothing to do with me. Believers, I have seen the wheel in the middle of the air where old age rises and laughs, and on Lakewood Midway became, in 5 strides, a kind of loving, a mortal, a dutiful son. There's another poem of mine, a little more recent than that, about fathers and sons, which I call the Aura. It's about rock and roll. This is about a man whose son has a portable radio that he has at his waist, and wherever he goes, so do the Beatles, so do Herman's Hermits, and all that. This is true, I suppose, in more families than one. When the father, an irritated middle age, trying to get his sleep out in the morning, first he hears Ringo Starr far off in a distance. And he thinks if he lies still enough, he'll go away. But then the boy's door opens and there's a blast of music. But then there's another brief respite as the boy goes into the bathroom and closes the door, and the father thinks maybe he can go back to sleep, and there's water running and he can't hear the music. But then the bathroom door opens and it starts in again. And the music goes down the hall maybe into the kitchen, and you can hear it moving all over the house, moving, first coming from one direction, then coming from another direction. Then you know you got to get up. This is a poem about that kind of situation, and about the fact that in this particular case the boy is killed in one of those unfair collisions between a bicycle and an automobile. And the transition takes place in the father from hating this kind of music to realizing that it's a thing that characterizes boy most certainly to him, that the music that the boy carried really on his body is the thing that he, the father, most closely identifies with his son. So he begins to seek it out. I had to grim time writing this because my own boy was pretty badly hurt in an automobile accident, although luckily not killed. But I had a very good time with one part of it because I set it as part of the technical problem of the poem to invent a couple of new names for rock and roll groups and put them into the poem. So I invented a couple of new names, and when the poem came out, I guess it was in the New Yorker, a music company wrote to me and asked me if they could use the names of groups of rock and roll people that they had. And I said, oh yes, sure, donate it free of charge. And I've been eagerly scanning all the record lists for any new releases of the last survivors or the Skimmers, but I think they probably are never to be now. But anyway, if you hear them, that's where the names come from. A poem called The Aura. He used to wake to him with a sense of music coming along with the body and movement. It swayed with the motion of a hip rolling into the bathroom. And lying in bed in the winter dark of fathers, he heard rock and roll closed off while water ran through it. Then the door opening, music opening, strolling down the hall, bad music moving all over the house, electric guitars that followed somebody around. It was his son, with his portable radio always at his belt, leaning over, adjusting the dial for disc jockeys. That would be the Skimmers, and that the last survivors mourning afar in the kitchen, who moved when the living moved. He could hear him coming from far away every dawn, and now the sound still coming from everywhere is grief, unstoppable. At the beginning of his teens, his last year of bicycles, the wild music traveling through the suburbs from junior high was broken on the road. But it leapt everywhere into odd places. From every angle it does not cease to be heard, the aura surrounding his son. He cannot hear it early in the morning unless he turns on his radio by the bed or leaves it on all night. But in supermarkets it comes forth from the walls. It glances from plate glass in department stores, and he moves within his boy's chosen sounds. In cars, theaters, in filling stations, in beer joints where he sits as though in the next phase his son would have lived, hearing voices giving prizes for naming of tunes, those stations never off the air. He sits still wherever he is, as though caught with music on him, or as if he were about to be given it somewhere in the region of the stomach. That sound is the same, and yet not. There is too much steadiness in it. None is carried rightly. None wavers with the motion of adolescent walking. None lumbers as it should. Still it is there, in trios of girls, in fake folk singers from Brooklyn. And he enters anywhere, his son's life, without the waking to it, the irreplaceable motion of a body. Bongos, steel guitars, a precious cheapness he would have grown out of, something, music. I'll just read two more, one relatively short and the other a little longer. There's a new poem of mine which is called Adultery. I tried a long time I noticed the proliferation of this activity. And I've often wondered, exactly why. Many of the times it takes place between people who are happily married or happily enough. And I saw when I tried to write this that it would be very largely a question of motivation and the poem would have to try to assign some reason as to why this happened as much as it does. And I wrote a lot of awful dull stuff on it. You wouldn't think you could make a subject like that dull, but any writer can make any subject dull. And I put it away. I still was worried about it and wondering what the key to it was of the particular poem I wanted to write. And I wasn't given it, and I didn't have any notion that I was given the key until I saw a movie called Harlow recently, the first of the two competing films, the one that they made in 8 days. You wonder what they did with the other 6 days. But anyway, there was a scene in there that I thought I had one very good conversational pass in it that nobody noticed but me, and I'm sure maybe the writer that wrote the script. But it's a scene where Jean Harlow comes into the room of the office of Paul Byrne, who is a producer and a man with secret sorrows. He's supposed to be terribly intellectual and sensitive and everything. You know this because he puts a Beethoven record on the turntable, right there in front of Jean Harlow and everything, which shows that he's a terribly sensitive person and everything. And she says actually he's impotent. But you don't know that until later, but then you find it out without too much having to figure it out. But anyway, she says to him, Mr. Byrne, I don't see why you you bother with me. I'm only a sex goddess. And he looks away with infinite pain in his eyes, and he says, Jean, that's not such a small thing to be after all. For the race of men, sex is the only stay against despair and death. And I said, yes. That's it. Right. So I got up and I went out of the theater hugging my secret. And I went and worked on this poem all night and wrote it around that idea. And also tried to work in some of the decor of places where adulterous relationships go on. They're always going on in back street hotels and motels, various places like that, where there's always awful calendar art on the walls. Have you seen the one of the Indian in the sunrise like that? I'm sure you've seen that picture. I mean, maybe not under exactly those circumstances, but and the one of the driving the last spike in the Union Pacific Railway. Well, there's these two fellows in top hats like this, bringing the nation together and everything. Anyway, there are always a lot of those pictures around, but people who engage in these things will dare anything on to go any kind of circumstances or decor or bad calendar art or whatever, because they have this sense of temporary immortality as a result of it. So I thought, or so the poem seems to think. Anyway, it's a poem called Adultery. We have all been in rooms we cannot die in, and they are odd places and sad. Often Indians are standing eagle-armed on hills in the sunrise, open wide to the Great Spirit, or gliding in canoes, or cattle are browsing on the walls far away, gazing down with the eyes of our children not far away. Or there are men driving the last rail spike which has turned gold in their hands. Gigantic forepleasure lives among such scenes, and we are alone with it at last. There is always some weeping between us, and someone is always checking a wristwatch by the bed to see how much longer we have left. Nothing can come of this. Nothing can come of us. Of me with my grim techniques, or you who have sealed your womb with a ring of convulsive rubber. Although we come together, nothing will come of us. But we would not give it up, for death is beaten by praying Indians, by distant cows, historical hammers, by hazardous meetings that bridge a continent. One could never die here, never die while crying. My lover, my dear one, I will see you next week when I'm in town. I will call you if I can. Please get hold of, please don't. Oh God, please don't anymore, I can't bear. Listen, we have done it again. We are still living. Sit up and smile, God bless you. Guilt is magical. I'll conclude with a poem called Slave Quarters. People ask me, since I'm a Southerner, why don't you write something about the racial situation? And I say, well, I've been working on something about that for a long time. And I say to them, I'm not really interested in leaping into the breach with that ephemeral stuff that you write. There's a lot of ephemeral stuff on that. And I thought, since it's such a part of my own life as a Southerner and as an American, that I would try to take some time and make one statement on it, and that would say everything that I know or feel about it. So I wrote a poem called Slave Quarters, supposedly about a modern man who tries to understand what it might have been like to be a slave owner. I've noticed, and I suppose you have too, that every Negro, almost every Negro that you see, has some admixture of white characteristics. And since intermarriage has been admissible or even unattainable as an idea, only very recently, these cohabitations of the races have always beforehand taken place in the most secret and shameful circumstances, beside, above, beyond the law, beyond public approval. This seems to me one of the most terrible things about it, and I suppose this began, something that has continued in very surreptitious ways, began when white slave owners would buy Negro women and cohabit with them and raise children who would be their children and would not, but yet would not be acknowledged as their children, but would be owned as slaves like the other slaves. The heart of the problem seemed to me to reside somewhere in that situation. So I wrote this poem called Slave Quarters, where I imagine what it might be like for a white slave owner down on the coastal islands of Georgia. This particular one lives there. To go out from his house, the large house, the owner's house, on one of these secret surreptitious journeys across the sand and across the shells to slave quarters to possess one of the Negro women that he actually did own. But I thought maybe that people haven't quite understood what this entailed for him. The 19th century, especially in the South, so the 18th as well, was a time of awful and really awful gentility. Somebody said that the whole antebellum Southern ethos was founded on the novels of Sir Walter Scott, and that's not a good thing to found a society on. But they had this crushing gentility, and I thought that maybe for the owner, under these circumstances, that this kind of activity, this secret activity, would restore some of his own bodily spontaneity to him, and that whether he would have admitted this or no, this maybe would have been at least part of the reason why he did it. Anyway, it's a poem about slave quarters where a modern man stands at twilight in a place where there once was a manor house and looks across grass to where the old slave quarters there used to be and where there are only a few remnants and walls left. And imagining what it might have been like for the man who lived in the house where he's now standing, where there's no house anymore, but only weeds and wind. A poem called Slave Quarters, and this will be the last thing I'll read. In the great place the great house is gone from, in the sun room near the kitchen of air, I look across at low walls of slave quarters and feel my imagining loins rise with the madness of owners to take off the master's white clothes and slide all the way into moonlight 200 years old with this moon. Let me go, ablaze with my old me scent, in moonlight made by the mind from the dusk sun, in the yard where my dogs would smell for once what I totally am, flaming up in their brains as the master they but dimly had sensed through my clothes. Let me stand as though moving at midnight, now at the instant of sundown, when the wind turns from sea wind to land, and the marsh grass hovers, changing direction. There was this house that fell before I got out. I can pull it over me where I stand, up from the earth, back out of the shells of the sea. Become with the change of this air a coastal islander, proud of his grounds, his dogs, his spinet from Savannah, his pale daughters, his war with the sawgrass, pushed back into the sea it crawled from. Near a dark, unseen, I can begin to dance inside my gabardine suit, as though I had left my silk nightshirt in the hall of mahogany and crept to slave quarters to live out the secret legend of owners. Ah, stand up, blonde loins, another love is possible. My thin wife would be sleeping or would not mention my absence. The moonlight on these rocks can be picked like cotton by a crazed owner dancing mad with the secret repossession of his body, phosphorescent and mindless, shedding blonde-headed shadow on the sand, hounds pressing in their sleep around him, smelling his foot blood on the strange ground that lies between skins, with the roof blowing off slave quarters to let the moon in, burning the years away, in just that corner where crabgrass proves it lives outside of time. Who seeks the other color of his body, his loins giving off a frail light on the dark, lively shipwreck of grass, seas, water live where the half-moon touches, the moon made whole in one wave, very far from the silent piano, the copy of Walter Scott closed on its thin papered battles, where his daughter practiced, decorum preventing the one bead of sweat and all that lace collected at her throat from breaking inhumanly running over Mozart's unmortal keys. I come past a sand crab pacing sideways, his eyes out on stalks, the bug-eyed vision of fiddler crabs sneaking a light on the run from the split moon, holding in it a white man stepping down the road of clamshells and cotton, his eyes out on stems, the tops of the sugar cane soaring, the sawgrass walking. I come past the stale pools left over from high tide, where the crab in the night sand is basting himself with his claws, moving ripples outward, feasting on brightness, and above a gull also crabs slowly, tacks, jibes, then turning the corner of wind, receives himself like a brother as he glides down upon his reflection. My body has a color not yet freed. In that ruined house, let me throw obsessive gentility off. Let Africa rise upon me like a man whose instincts are delivered from their chains, where they lay close packed and wide-eyed in muslin sheets, as though in the miserly holding of too many breaths by one ship. No, worked in silver, their work lies all around me, the fields dissolving into the sea, and not on a horse, I stoop to the soil, working, gathering, moving to the rhythm of a music that has crossed the ocean in chains. In the grass, the great singing void of slave labor about me, the moonlight bringing sweat out of my back as though the sun changed skins upon me, some other man moving near me on horseback, whom I look in the eyes once a day. There in that corner, her bed turned to grass. Unsheltered by these walls, the outside fields form slowly anew in a kind of barreling blowing, bend in all the right places as faintly Michael rows the boat ashore, his spiritual lungs entirely filling the sail. How take on the guilt of slavers? How shudder like one who made money from buying a people to work as ghosts in this blowing solitude? I only stand here upon shells, dressed poorly for nakedness, poorly for the dark wrecked hovel of rebirth, picking my way in thought to the black room where starlight blows off the roof, and the great beasts that died with the minds of the first slaves stand at the door asking for death, asking to be forgotten. The sadness of elephants, the visionary pain in the heads of incredibly poisonous snakes, lion, wildebeest, giraffe, all purchased also when one wished only labor. Those beasts becoming for the white man the animals of Eden, emblems of sexual treasure. All beasts attending me now, my dreamed dogs snarling at the shades of eland and cheetah on the dispossessed ground where I dance in my clothes beyond movement. In 9 months she would lie with a knife between her teeth to cut the pain of bearing a child who belongs in no world. My hair and that boy turned black, my skin darkened by half, his lightened by that half exactly, the beasts of Africa reduced to cave shadows flickering on his brow as I think of him. A child would rise from that place with half my skin. He could for an instant of every day when the wind turns look me in the eyes. What do you do when passing your blood beyond death to another in secret, into another who takes your features and adds a misplaced Africa to them, changing them forever as they must live? What happens to you when such a one bears you after your death into rings of battling light, a heavyweight champion, through the swirling glass of 4 doors, in epauletted coats, into places where you learn to wait on tables, into sitting in all-night cages of parking lots, into raising a sun-sided spade in a gang of men on a tar road working until the crickets give up? What happens when the sun goes down and the white man's loins still stir in a house of air, still draw him toward slave quarters? When Michael's voice is heard bending the sail like grass, the real moon begins to come apart on the water, and 200 years are turned back on with the headlights of a car. When you learn that there is no hatred like love in the eyes of a wholly owned face. When you think of what it would be like, what it has been, what it is to look once a day into an only son's brown, waiting, wholly possessed, amazing eyes, and not acknowledge, but own. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very deeply grateful.